Wonderful worms. The day before yesterday, Tilly Mint and Mrs. Hardcastle went down to the park to find some magic. They didn't say they were going to find some magic, but that's what Tilly thought. She felt it in her bones. The birds were singing brightly in the trees and fetching and carrying things for their nests. But all Mrs. Hardcastle seemed to be interested in was worms. "Just look at that worm, Tilly," she said, when they walked past a bed of earth that had just been turned. "Just look at that blobby old worm." Tilly didn't like worms. "Ew," she said. "I'm not going near a worm." Mrs. Hardcastle was surprised. "I thought everyone liked worms, Tilly Mint," she said. "Worms are wonderful. How they wibble and they wobble all around. How they dibble and they dabble and they double up and down. How they're pink and how they're pokey, how they pull across the ground, how they wind and how they wander, how they wiggle round and round." "Not to me they're not," said Tilly. "That worm's got nowhere to go. He looks bored. He's like a piece of string without a parcel." "He's like a shoelace looking for a shoe," laughed Mrs. Hardcastle. "He's like a piece of spaghetti that nobody wants to eat," said Tilly Mint. "Don't you be so sure about that," Mrs. Hardcastle said. "Somebody wants to eat him. Look." Just above them, on the branch of a high tree, sat a little brown bird, singing his head off. His eyes were as bright as a button. He was watching the worm. Suddenly he flew down from the branch and he hopped across to where the worm was wriggling around, with nowhere to go, looking bored. "Look out!" shouted Mrs. Hardcastle to the worm, but she was too late. The hoppity bird had put his beak right round the worm. The worm tried to wriggle back down into the earth. The brown bird dug his feet in and pulled and pulled and pulled. The pink worm stretched and stretched and stretched, and pop! Out came the worm. The brown bird fell over. Then he stood up, shook his feathers, and flew off with the worm, waving helplessly in his beak. "Hooray!" Mrs. Hardcastle clapped her hands. Now it was Tilly who was surprised. "I thought you liked worms, Mrs. Hardcastle," she said. "So I do," Mrs. Hardcastle said, "but I like birds more. Just think of those little baby birds all snug and warm in their nest, waiting for their tea. They'll be very pleased when they see that worm." "I wouldn't mind being a baby bird, all snug and warm in a nest," thought Tilly. "But I'd jump right out of it if anyone gave me worms for my tea. Fancy eating a worm! I nearly ate a worm once, Tilly Mint, when I was a little girl, but oh, that was so long ago. That was years and years and years ago. I've nearly forgotten all about it." And when Mrs. Hardcastle said that, it was in her drowsy, far-away, remembery sort of voice, and her eyes seemed to be looking into long, long ago. Then she sat down on a park bench and she fell asleep.